بشنو از نی چون حکایت می کند، از جداییه شکایت می کند. کاز نیستن چون مرا ببریده اند، از نفیرم مرد و زن نالیده اند. Listen to the song of the reed in its weeping, for it tells the story of our separation. For since the day the reed was torn from its riverbank, in its sorrow is heard the cry of every man, of every woman. Once there was a pacha, a king who had a wife that had left him many years before for the other world. A king who had many children who went out into the world to conquer their own kingdoms. A king who one day found himself all alone, looking into his own future. And at that moment, the king asked himself this question: who will be the companion? Who will be the companion of my remaining years? But as soon as he asked that question, he remembered he had 2 servants who had been in his service for many, many years. Now one of the servants was plain of dress and plainer of speech. He was the dependable one. He was always there when you needed him. And yet he was so quiet, so unassuming. Most of the time you barely noticed he was there. Now the name of that servant was Lokman. Now as for the other servant, you always knew he was there. He had soiled clothes and a foul-smelling breath and a loud voice, and he always made a point of making as much noise as possible as he entered a room, only so that you would notice he was there. And the name of that servant was Duruk. And so on that day the king called before him these 2 servants. There was Lokman, in his clean clothes, looking shyly to the ground, not having the nerve to look the king straight in the eye. And there was Duruk, with his foul-smelling breath and his loud, brassy voice. Well, the king took one look at Duruk and said this: "My dear servant, do you see this gold dinar I hold in my hand? I want you to take it with you and go to the hammam, to the bath, and give yourself a refreshing bath. And with the money that is left, I want you to buy yourself fine clothes and perfumes. And when you have done so, you can return to me." And without a further word, Duruk left him so the king could be alone with his servant Lokman. And the king turned to this servant, saying this: "My dear Lokman, so many years you have been in my service, and it is only today that we have a chance to speak person to person. Let me ask you, all these years, have you been a faithful servant? For based on what Duruk has told me, you have been a very lazy servant at times and not working as well as you could. Is what your friend Duruk say true?" At these words, Lokman looked down shamefaced. And he struggled to reply to the king, saying this, "Alas, your majesty, alas, your majesty, perhaps what my friend Duruk says is all too true. For I am not wise enough. I am not wise enough to see beyond the illusions I have of who I am. Maybe what Duruk says is true. Maybe I have not worked all these years as hard as I could. Maybe there were moments where my laziness overtook me. Maybe, after all, this report you hear of me is all too true." Now when the king heard this, he smiled gently at his servant Lokman, and then he asked him this, "We have talked about you, but now you tell me, has your friend Duruk been a faithful servant?" And at once Lokman raised his head and looked straight into the eye of the king, and he said, Your Majesty, you do not have a more faithful servant than Duruk. Do not be misled by his soiled clothes, for he is so eager in your service that he forgets his own dress. Do not be misled by his foul breath, for he is so eager to serve you that he does not even think of his own comforts and his own perfuming." Well, at these words, the king smiled even more broadly at his servant Lokman, and he said to him, "Lokman, now I dismiss you, but only for a short while, for something tells me that we will speak once again." And with those words, Lokman left the presence of the king. Now by that time, Duruk had returned from the hammam, from the bath, and he was dressed in these fine clothes, and his breath was so sweet-smelling, and there was a fragrance that came from his body from all the choice perfumes he covered himself with. And at that moment, the king looked on Duruk, and he looked on him proudly that he had such a handsome and well-kept servant. And then the king turned to Duruk, who was standing before him, saying this, "My dear servant Duruk, so many years you have been in my service, and it is only today that we have a chance to speak, person to person. Now let me ask you this. Has your friend Lokman been a faithful servant to me? Speak truthfully." "Your Majesty," replied Duruk, "you ask me this question. Don't you know that Lokman is the laziest servant of all? He never does his work. He always slacks off, and he complains about you incessantly behind your back, and all the things he does, all the awful things. I could tell you all sorts of stories about him. The day that Lokman..." And then the king raised his hand and he cried out, "Stop! Stop! Dear servant Duruk, how ugly are your lies when they are told with such a perfumed breath. Indeed, now I know that I do not want you as the companion of my remaining years. I will dismiss you with full wages at once, and yet you will never return to my palace again." "Very well, your Majesty," frowned Duruk. "Very well, carry on with your illusions. Yes, Lokman is very nice with you, but you have never tested him. Show him the single instance of cruelty, and you will see his true colors. You will see what a servant he is really, and not what you imagine him to be." And with those words, Duruk left the presence of the king, never to return. But those words of Duruk got the king thinking. After all, what Duruk says is true. Not once have I shown the slightest cruelty to my servant Lokman. What would happen if I did? And then at that moment he remembered. He remembered that the cook that morning was speaking of a melon in the kitchen that had gone sour. And at once he ordered that very melon be cut into slices, placed on a silver tray, and that silver tray placed right before him. And when that silver tray, covered with the slices of that sour melon, were there, then and only then the king called again Lokman to appear before him. "Dear Lokman," the king said to him, I am very pleased with the conversation we had today. And now I want you to share in this refreshment. Please help yourself to a slice of one of these fresh melon." And so Lokman reached for one of those slices. And then he bit into it. "Your Majesty, this melon is so sweet that I desire another. May I have another slice?" "Of course," said the king, "help yourself." And then Lokman reached for another slice. "Oh, Your Majesty, this slice of melon is even sweeter than the other. May I have another?" At this moment the king was wondering, had they brought the wrong melon? "Of course, Lokman, help yourself to another." And once he bit into that melon, Lokman praised the sweetness of that melon that he was eating. And he ate one slice after another, until there was one slice left, and the king raised his hand and he said, "Lokman, this last slice is for me. Indeed, I too want to taste the sweetness of this melon." And so he reached for the melon and bit into it. And the king cried out, "What are you saying, Lokman? This melon is sour, so sour it bites at my throat. Why did you lie to me?" "Your Majesty," replied Lokman, "you misunderstood me. For the sweetness did not come from the melon. The sweetness came from the one who offered it. Your Majesty, when I first came to your service those many years ago, I was but an orphan. No one loved me. But once I entered your service, you gave me your love. You made me feel as part of your family. You showed me countless kindness over the years. And so after all this time, anything you offer me, I cannot taste anything but sweetness in it." And at these words, the king smiled at Lokman. "My dear Lokman," he said, "my dear Lokman, I want no one else but you as the companion of my remaining years. For there are more truths in the lies that your loving heart invents than in all the truths told by a heart of stone." And so from that day forward, the king lived the remaining years of his life. And during all that time, his servant Lokman was never far from his side. Beshno azne chon hekayat mikonad. Az jodaya shekayat mikonad. Listen to the song of the reed in its weeping, for it tells the story of our separation.